So, our last mini lecture in this week's series takes a step back and focuses on the driving tectonics associated with large scale continental extension and metamorphic core complexes. And one of the first things to consider is the spatial distribution of core complexes. So, this figure shows continental core complexes in red, oceanic core complexes in green, and core complexes that are developed on now continental passive margins in orange. And right away, you may notice, especially if you ignore the oceanic core complexes, which are sort of a separate phenomenon, but the red dots are all decorating ancient or in some cases active orogenic belts. The North American Cordillera, as we discussed, the Mediterranean region, including the Aegean, parts of southern Iberia, and some places in the Alps. And then, of course, there are many in Southeast Asia and some quite young active ones in Indonesia and New Guinea. So it appears that this mode of distributed extension and core complex development is not particularly common in simple continental rift zones, but it does absolutely define extension that develops in orogenic regions. And if you look closely at the timing relationships between orogenic uplift and the onset of extension, there appear to be two types of relationships. Some of the core complexes on the last slide appear to be forming or to have formed during ongoing subduction. So we'd refer to them as syn-orogenic, and they tend to occur primarily in a back arc setting. And then there's another subset of MCCs or core complexes that appear to be post-orogenic, and these develop late or immediately after an orogenic event, such as subduction or continental collision, ends. So let's look now at some of the potential processes involved in these different relationships between orogeny and extension. So one hypothesis for what causes back arc extension is the process of slab rollback, which is a natural consequence of slab sinking or slab pull. Here's a video of an analog model showing the slab rollback process. And you can envision how if the upper plate is coupled to the slab as it rolls back through time, then somewhere the upper plate has to extend, and the back arc is a potentially warm, weak region where strain can localize enough to facilitate that extension. So that's certainly one possible explanation for large-scale syn-orogenic extension, particularly applicable perhaps to the Mediterranean region. Another process that's been invoked and that likely goes hand in hand with slab rollback is corner flow in the Mantle wedge. There's evidence from seismic anisotropy and from analog and numerical models of subduction that the subduction process sets up a sort of circular flow pattern above the slab that can lead to further uplift, extension, and heating in the back arc that will promote core complex development. It's also important to consider the role of the overriding plate. The last two examples are focused on simple downwelling and slab pull, but the overriding plate may have its own kinematics that's independent of the slab itself. So in some instances, back arc extension leading to core complex development may simply be due to slow convergence of the slab that's then coupled with an overriding plate that is actually moving away from the slab more rapidly than the convergence velocity. So those were examples of syn-orogenic processes that have been suggested to contribute to continental extension. The other case that we already discussed briefly last week is the idea of post-orogenic extension or gravitational collapse. And although it's a bit silly, I like this cheese analogy. You take a block of cheese out of the fridge and you set it on the counter. It's still cold, so it retains its rectangular shape for a while, but then you forget about it and go to work. And while you're gone, it warms up and starts to slowly collapse and spread out in a circular pattern under its own weight. This idea of gravitational collapse of orogenic belts is fairly similar. As you build up an origin, it starts out forming this large stable plateau, but the progressive thickening of the crust causes the geothermal gradient to go up substantially until eventually the rheology of the plateau is too weak to sustain its own topography. So it collapses and spreads out, forming these large-scale extensional features. There are, of course, more quantitative ways to explain this, but conceptually, this is what's happening. In addition to the orogenic collapse process, there are other processes that can punctuate the end of a subduction event that also lead to collapse and extension. For example, if the lithosphere is thickened homogeneously, then the mantle lithosphere will tend to form a sort of keel that can eventually destabilize and drip off from the overlying crust. And this will lead to orogenic collapse and large-scale extension as well, because now there's no mantle lithosphere to counteract the buoyancy of the thickened crust. The process of slab breakoff can have a very similar effect, where necking and dripping of the slab removes the negative buoyancy attached to the crust, causing uplift and extensional collapse. The last thing that I'll note is that all of these processes I mentioned, whether synorogenic or post-orogenic, result in significant heating at the base of the lithosphere that's associated with the extensional process. You basically get upwelling of the stenospheric mantle into the extending region. And so you may recall I mentioned in an earlier lecture that continental extensional domains all show this kind of typical isothermal decompression during exhumation pattern, where the temperatures stay hot even though you're exhuming to the surface quite rapidly. And this input of heat associated with these different extensional processes is the reason why. So here's a summary of what we covered in the video mini lectures for this week, 4A through 4F. I'll just leave it here in case it's useful for your notes. And during our discussion on Friday, these are the topics I'd like to hear from you on. Firstly, of course, I'd like to hear about any aspects that were unclear, questions that you have, but I also want to check in with all of you to see if you can kind of answer these discussion questions generally in your own words after watching the lecture series. In other words, these are the things that I hope you're able to take away from this lecture series.